Thank you, everybody, for coming today. A girl came up to her mother one Sunday afternoon and said, "Mom, where do human beings come from?" And her mother replied, "Well, about 6, 7 million years ago, human beings and chimps and apes descended from a common ancestor. And that's where we came from." She's kind of satisfied. She walks away. A couple days later, she comes up to Dad. Says, "Daddy, where do human beings come from?" And Dad says, "Well, a long time ago, near the Middle East, man came from two people called Adam and Eve." She kind of scratched her head, said, "Wait a second. Mom said we descended from apes and a common ancestor, and you say we came from Adam and Eve." And her dad says, "Well, your mom told you her side of the family, and I told you mine." We're going to talk about evolution today. The title of this is Darwin or Design: What Biology Reveals About the Secrets of Life. What is evolution? Is it wrong to believe in evolution? Do we have to fear evolution? Is science and God like parallel train tracks that never intersect? You have this realm and you have this realm. Evolution is everywhere, and we all understand it on some level. We are exposed to it in childhood. We can't escape it. It oozes from our subconscious. It shapes our thinking, even in areas like politics and social issues. Even the Constitution is now said to be an evolving document. It's even a buzzword when we make a mistake and we just kind of quip to ourselves, "I must be evolving." Though it is billed as bedrock truth, it is just a theory, and more like an hypothesis. Evolution is just as much a philosophy of science as it is about raw data and observation. It's as much about interpretation as it is observation. So let's get in defining the terms. Let's get into the terms. I had a conversation with a guy one time. I was online. I sometimes go on these forums and I engage with people. And I was presenting my arguments, and the guy just came back and said, "I don't care what you say, I believe in evolution." So I replied to him and I said, "Okay, well, which kind?" And right then he shut the conversation up. He went away. Didn't continue because he didn't know. He didn't know. Now, there is a movement today to try and put all branches of evolution under the umbrella of evolution. But really, that's an attempt to minimize the weaknesses, because when you branch out the three branches of evolution and categorize them, the theory falls flat on its face. Now, microevolution is where organisms exhibit some differences over time, adapt to changing environments, or have different gene expression through selective pressure. An example is bacteria developing resistance to certain antibiotics. This is called small-scale evolution, adaptation, and is something everybody accepts. Macroevolution is where organisms larger than species have evolved from a common ancestor. That is, everything higher than a species on the taxonomic chart is said to have evolved, such as genus, or family, order, class, phylum. A major tenet of evolution is gradualism. For the theory to stand, there is a gradual, almost infinite, unbroken chain of organisms where one organism transforms into another. Therefore, there must be evidence of these variations in the fossil record. Now, the engine room of these transitions is the molecular level, really small, where multiple simultaneous changes must occur. And you will see the impossibility of these simultaneous changes taking place later on. Now, do you remember the great tree of life, right? The phylogenetic tree is what they call this. It's presented where living things can theoretically be traced to a common ancestor lower in the trunk. That's a common ancestor, and they branch out. Darwin originally theorized this tree from his breeding studies as well as fossils. He saw fossils and he thought up this theory. Though we never saw any transitions, he speculated that there must be sophisticated and complex links in the lineage of creatures. There must be. The major groups of life should blend seamlessly and smoothly into one another from countless transitional forms. Now, though Darwin did not know about genetics, he did believe there was some inward process in organisms that caused these changes. Our President Obama, said this: "I do not believe it is helpful to our students to cloud discussions of science with non-scientific theories like intelligent design that are not subject to experimental scrutiny." Really? Design is not scientific? Let us see just how scientific evolution is. I'm sure you're familiar with Jane Goodall. She is the celebrated primatologist who studied chimps in Africa. She said in her research taught her that our aggressive tendencies, quote, "have probably been inherited from an ancient primate some 6 million years ago." Probably inherited is her term. Science is supposed to be about precision and theory based on fact, but probably sounds more like science fiction, as Goodall is more speculative than she is accurate. Atheistic scientists attack those who advocate for design because they appeal to some unknown mystery of a transcendent creator. That's what they do. They attack them and they say, oh, we just appeal to God and that solves the whole thing? Yet probably, the term probably sounds like imprecise language and appeals to the unknown of random chance. Right? Jerry Coyne, evolutionary geneticist, also defines evolution with some uncertainty. Organisms originally evolved over time and split into different species, and the main engine of evolutionary change was natural selection, he says. Sure, some details of these processes are unsettled, but there is no argument among biologists about the main claims. Now we're going to see that this is far from the truth. That not only organisms gradually evolve, but that all of biologists are in agreement with the main claims. Let's get familiar with some of the terms. One term you'll hear about is fairly often is called LUCA, L-U-C-A, which refers to the last universal common ancestor. It's a search for this. And each species has a LUCA, and then it goes into another LUCA, another common ancestor. So theoretically, you can trace this all the way back to primitive organisms. Even modern forms of Darwin theory are based on the assumption of common descent. Now, there's another concept you need to be familiar with. It is called the modification with descent. It's a very, very famous term in Darwinism, which characterizes changes taking place within organisms on small, incremental levels over long periods of time. This is a major premise. It purports to affirm the philosophy of Darwin of organisms going from simple to complex through gradual changes. Now, the last branch of evolution is called chemical evolution, where life started by a spontaneous collision of molecules in a prebiotic soup. or warm, watery environment of elements that came together in some organizing fashion. This area falls under the category of origin science. But origin sciences are more speculative because it's a study of the past. We don't have the past anymore. Macroevolution is what we call an operational science because it can be studied today, the processes. By the way, an interesting thought here. The title of Darwin's book is called The Origin of the Species. But it absolutely has nothing to do with origins. It's a theory of the morphing of life forms once they somehow got going. But where did they originally come from? This is still the great mystery that confounds biologists, particularly if they have a material emphasis. There's another term we need to know, and this is Darwinism. Darwinism. It's a generic term that refers to a closed system of life being explained by merely natural processes. Closed system. Darwin originally formed this theory from the fossil record and his own breeding programs. But neo-Darwinists carry the torch further in their attempt to justify it through their studies of genetics and molecular biology, so they go inward. Darwin originally didn't have all this equipment and these microscopes, so he just looked at forms, and they look similar. Similar body plans automatically meant a descendant. Okay? Similar body plans automatically meant something was related to something, is what his theory was. Even neo-Darwinists go inward, and they try and look at the processes of biology on a molecular level. Now, what originally began as a theory based on appearance and structure is carried internally to the realm of biogenetics. Intelligent design, another term we need to know. Intelligent design is a theory that enters science on science's terms and draws the logical conclusion that design is in the data. Design is in the data. Strictly speaking, it does not make inferences as to the nature or attributes of that designer, and it has no theological assumptions addressed in the mind of the designer. It merely deals with the artifacts as they are discovered. If you were taking a walk in nature, you look down amongst all the millions of rocks, and you happen to find an arrowhead, right? That rock is different than all those millions. There's something different about it. It's still a rock, but it has design. It was shaped by a designer. You would never attribute that arrowhead to chance by a random shaping of the stone through some combination of forces in the earth's soil. You'd never do that. Design recognizes intelligent causes as empirically detectable, even though there are secondary causes in the universe as well. Let me give you an example of this. What is the difference between an acorn and an oak tree? What's the difference?
30 years.
Yeah, right? Time, right? 30 years. I mean, they're both the same, but they're both different. The acorn has programmed within it the dynamics necessary to grow into a big tree. Programmed in it. Science can't say it's completely random because it has some deterministic laws. But it can be argued that an intelligent designer is involved in imparting the necessary information into the acorn. Design is both anterior to and complicit with secondary causes. Intelligent design points out that nature cannot be the origin of itself, nor can it come about by unguided natural forces. It allows some naturalistic mechanisms like natural selection, by which organisms adapt to their environment. Nothing wrong with that. But Natural forces are not responsible for incredibly complex biomolecular systems. Nature is incomplete in possessing all the resources needed to bring about the biological structures. For example, think of a rusty car sitting in a field. It shows both products of design, which is the car, and natural forces, which is the rust. Blind natural forces by themselves could not produce the design of that car. Nor is the universe a closed system where natural causes explain everything. Rather, it is like a designer that interacts with the universe the way a skilled musician plays an instrument. Where intelligence is beautifully displayed is in the information-rich biological structures. And intelligent design is all about just that, intelligence. A living organism is not just a clump of matter. What makes life distinct and separates organic from inorganic matter is not the elements. It's how the elements are arranged. It's how they're arranged. The dirt under our feet and the matter in our bodies is the same. It's the arrangement through information that explains the gulf between the two. Right? Do you have any questions there? Okay, that's fine. Naturalistic mechanisms are incapable of producing information-rich structures that make up biology. Intelligent design acts in concert with material mechanisms without being reducible to them. Design acts in concert with material mechanisms without being reducible to them. Let's talk about DNA. DNA is what we call a classic chicken or the egg scenario. One foundational area where nature displays design that nature alone cannot account for is DNA. Is nature complete to bring about information-rich structures in biology? Where does DNA come into play in the chemical evolution of life? It has to be present in the earliest life forms for life to work. It has to be there. Okay? But where does it come from? This is why self-organization is an argument that does not hold, because you need information. Information in the arrangement of matter is a major problem for chemical evolution. Though empirically verifiable, information is so highly complex that it transcends material explanations. Transcends them. Now, you all know the nucleotide bases of A, C, T, and G. Those are the 4 letters of DNA. And they're arranged in binary basis on each side of the chromosome. And they are really letters that encode proteins in the cell by which cells function. Monkeys typing letters at random on a keyboard don't form a message. Yet somehow the cell in the genome can discern the difference between a random assemblage of letters and a meaningful message. Somehow. If you were to walk through a remote national forest and you saw the letters Bill plus Susie on a tree, you would never attribute that to random chance. It's information. And that's the exact same with DNA in nature. Natural forces bridge the gap between the organic and the inorganic worlds through information. No naturalistic mechanism has the power to generate relevant information. This abstract element is what shapes matter into design structures which natural forces cannot account for. Now, from a reductionist point of view, this is a conundrum. Okay, this is a problem. Reductionist, what does that mean? It means all of reality, all of life is reduced to the material. That's what a reductionist means. This is a real problem for reductionist scientists. DNA is needed to create new cells, yet new cells are created with the DNA. A classic chicken or the egg. DNA is a message-bearing medium, an information coding system. It carries a message that tells a cell what kinds of proteins to make and when to make them. But if DNA carries a message, then the message cannot be an outgrowth of the medium. It wouldn't be a message at all. Information cannot be a product of the chemicals, just as the words on this page, right here, don't arise from the ink in the paper. You cannot reduce it to just materials. But this conundrum can be resolved if DNA is the product of design, not chance. And this is the advantage intelligent design brings to the science arena. And that is the information argument, which is an angle lacking in the Darwin's origin of life. Information has to do with origin, has as much to do with origin as chemicals. That's true. But chemistry is the carrier, it is not the source. Matter is passive. Matter is inert. But information is active and gives matter form and arrangement in specific ways. Chemistry provides the medium for life, but the information it carries cannot be reduced to it. And this relationship is fundamental in understanding our world. Let's give an analogy. Man-made machines provide the best analogy. An automobile is made from metal and plastics. But nothing useful arises unless they are arranged with detailed instructions. Since DNA was embedded into life from the beginning, intelligence is the most plausible explanation for the origin of life. Yes, question? Or? No, that's okay. We'll take him at the end then. That's fine. That's fine.
Well, I want to ask you something about DNA. I don't know a lot about DNA because I know football.
Sure.
Is this thing manufactures new stuff? Is it continually change the DNA, those four components?
Yeah.
So you can,
Well, it depends on the amino acid it's making. See, the whole workhorse of the cell are proteins. And what is needed to make proteins are amino acids. And each function of the cell has a different amino acid. So each coding is different for that amino acid function. But they don't change. No, they don't. That's amazing. That's what's amazing about it. Now, sometimes they'll change by the transcription process, which may be a little bit inaccurate, and that's when you can get into mutations that are harmful, such as cancers. But normally functioning cells, no, they don't change. And that's why we continue to reproduce. Now, even though they don't change and they're sort of grooved in this pattern, there's incredible complexity. And so that's a good question. Now, closed system materialism. Okay, that's the other option. If you don't believe in a design or a designer, you have to believe in life originated in a closed system. But there's a problem with that, and that is in the major mechanisms. The two mechanisms of the Darwinian machine are natural selection and random variation. Those are the two mechanisms. You have to have a mechanism. Obviously, one problem with that is where do the mechanisms come from? Right? Darwinism is completely sold on the philosophy that scientific materialism explains all of reality. Therefore, life is a closed system operating by an unbroken natural laws, or what some people call causal closure. Causal closure. In Darwinism, life is not so much emerging from mechanical processes as comprised of mechanical systems, which is another problem in itself. Okay? But, as one design scientist says this, if nature, as naturalism requires, is a closed nexus of undirected natural causes, then nature knows nothing about the functional nature of those descriptions. There is a logical fallacy with something being comprised of and superior over that process. Natural selection was discovered long before Darwin as a way of keeping species within certain boundaries. But when Darwin did, he was kind of caught up in the scientific materialism of the day, is he went further and he pushed natural selection as a generating force capable of producing new species. Natural selection, selective pressures, pressures in the environment, which would bring out new gene expressions that are already there. But that just pushes the buck, pushes it down the pipeline. Where did the environment come from, right? Where did the original genetic code come from, and all that? But Darwin's interpretation is quite a leap of the evidence, and these consequences scientists are still trying to vindicate today. To explain new life forms, natural selection is sometimes held to have powers to foresee what traits will benefit them in the future. So they jam into this idea of natural selection a foreseeable power. The problem is, though, natural selection is blind. It is without plan or purpose. It has no knowledge of the future. It can only arrange what's given. This goes back to one of the major tenets of evolution is utilitarian. It has to have a utilitarian function now. Therefore, it cannot foresee what it might need in the future. It has no prior knowledge of a system nor a specified pathway that needs to be hit in order to upgrade a species later. If it did, evolution would have powers of foresight and planning that the theory says it does not possess. Okay? Here's an example. Natural selection is an instant gratification mechanism with no goal or vision. It has to be utilized and utilitarian for the moment. In regards to the alleged evolution of apes to humans, for example, the first primates did not know they were supposed to evolve in such a way that humans could later appear. They didn't know it. Natural selection cannot select a portion of that genome with the intent of using that gene 7 or 8 million years later. Animals on Earth did not know they were supposed to evolve in a way that humans, for example, might later appear. There's no forward-looking mechanism, sight in the mechanism. This forward dynamic is a fatal error in the chance-based mechanism of evolutionary theory. So natural selection is not a creating force in biology, or a force capable of producing new species. It is really a scaling back force. It's a restrictive dynamic. For example, like when breeders, breed new dogs or larger cattle or sheep, all they're doing is reshuffling the genes. Okay? There's another law of biology called the law of conservation of information. In other words, a species cannot end up with more information than when it started from. But evolution violates that law. The other major mechanism of Darwinism is random variation or mutation. If natural selection is the paring down mechanism, the scaling in the morphing of species, random variation is the proposed generative force in the Darwinian model. And this is where chance comes into play. The generative force. The problem is that most, if not all, mutations are harmful or deleterious or nefarious. When environmental pressure is reduced, the benefit of a mutation tends to be lost. Mutations are really sideways movement at best, but they're usually harmful. There's no new novel information being created with mutation. Natural causes only rework things, and major changes require coordinated adaptations, which require extraordinary amounts of genetic information. And information always comes from intelligence. You cannot separate the ideas of information and intelligence. So again, it comes back to information, which is what intelligent design has been saying all along. The only way to flood new genetic information into the gene pool is not by mutations that alter protein molecules, but by altering the genes altogether. So mutations don't tweak. Mutations only tweak things, but they do not create. An ideal area of study for mutations is Drosophila, or the fruit fly. The fruit fly is desirable because it has quick reproductive cycles, has a short lifespan, and has a genome that is very easily manipulated. So in effect, you can speed up evolutionary time by studying this fly, literally millions of cycles. The results have shown that monstrosities are created, multiple sets of wings, legs coming out of the head, etc. Sure, there are changes, but there's no new structures, and the products are harmful. They don't help the survival value of the species. The bottom line is that natural selection is not a causal power. It can only select for future functions that are already present in helping organisms survive for the moment. A mutation is not a generative dynamic because organisms are never better. They're just different, and usually they're worse. Making the transition from an old to a new function is not a task for which any Darwinian mechanism is prepared for. People use the term random chance as though it were a generative force. But random chance is not a prescriptive term, but a descriptive term. We borrow this from statistics to describe probability. But it's not a generative force. It's not a dynamic in that sense. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. So right now, we will take a break. If we have any questions, we'll take some questions. Yes?
What I've noticed, like these onyx butterflies, they were flying. And people had done something to the trees that were growing close together, and the trees were affected, and the butterflies died from that because the trees have to be there, and when the wind blows through there, the leaves are there.
Right.
It causes some kind of chemical, not a chemical, but a physical change, so that the butterflies will stay warm enough.
Right.
So then, only certain times they go through this metamorphosis, and it has to be a certain temperature and a certain amount of time.
Right.
To do the metamorphosis.
That's right. Interesting.
It is.
So there's some kind of selective pressure there that caused the change, and that can either generate a new species with different gene expressions that were already inside, and they survived, and it can cause extinctions. But all we do is call that adaptation. Some people would call that as an example of evolution, but really that's an example of de-evolution. If anything, things are dying off. So, good point.
Question. In the animal world, grafting, like in trees, they grafted some parts of the main tree,
Yeah.
and then they grafted
Right.
the apple.
Sure.
What it produces,
A hybrid?
Is a hybrid.
Sure.
So, in a way, could they, could evolutionists, could they say it's relevant to them? Would it be?
Yeah, again, though, they may say some combination of natural forces could allow two species that not normally would mix to somehow have hybrids. Again, that's just hybridization. That's
They
speciation,
would make the mule.
right?
They
But
can't reproduce themselves.
yeah, but again, in that example you just gave, where we saw a new species because somebody put something in, grafted it into another, there's still a designer involved. You had a designer intentionally do that. He intentioned that to happen. So again, that kind of supports the design argument. Sure.
If it's relevant about the designer, why do scientists, they don't accept the concept of a designer? If everything is irrelevant, why don't they accept
Well, it's a good question. I mean,
the
I think scientists are smart enough to know that if they even open the door a little bit to a designer, that it may lead down the road to the idea of God. And then when you lead to that idea, then you have a moral component come into the picture. And a moral component means maybe I may have to clean my life up. Maybe God, because we all know what the idea of a God, the ramifications of God, and there's a moral aspect to that. And they don't want to do that.
But isn't it that science, true science, is by evidence?
Yes,
wherever
I agree.
it leads to?
I think so. And I think a true scientist, if he were on an honest quest for truth, would have to look at the evidence and see design everywhere as the best explanation. Now, intelligent design per se doesn't make any comments on who that designer is, but it is perfectly consistent with the Christian idea of God. And so you can argue for that with other arguments and other disciplines. You can bring in the idea of the existence of God. You can bring in evidences for the New Testament as a document, and so on. But yeah, I don't understand. I mean, it's for some reason, science originally was really birthed out of Christianity in many respects. The scientific method was generated out of the hermeneutics of studying Scripture, the very scientific method itself. In fact, some of the best scientists of old were theists. They believed in God, and they were very motivated by this idea of God to explore the world. Science originally began as another way to affirm the varied mysteries of a creator. Theology was once known as the queen of the sciences, and philosophy was her handmaiden, in the old philosophical sense of philosophy. Now, of course, philosophy in a modern sense means more the empirical method. But somehow we allowed science to be hijacked by those who came in and interpreted these things as a result of randomness, random causes. And I don't understand. We've kind of left that fight. So, we're re-engaging with that. It's interesting that Richard Dawkins, famous biologist, is really an atheist, and really vehement atheist. He made a statement one time. He says, Darwin made it possible for me to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. But if you think about that statement, if science is about pure raw data, he's making a metaphysical conclusion from that. He's going into this idea of atheism. Since when was science about atheism, if it's about data, right? So if they're going to bring in this metaphysical conclusion, a better metaphysical conclusion, if there is one, is design. There's a designer involved. We may not know the nature of the designer necessarily from nature itself, looking outside, but it's kind of sneaky. You see how they're sneaking in atheism all of a sudden? Since when is science about atheism, right? So, good question. Anything else? We'll take a little break. sure. It's about data. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, though, here's the thing. Okay. Science is just as much about philosophy as it is about data. The reason is everybody carries in with them into their work a lens, a worldview of how they see reality, of how they see life. And you can be a relativist, you can be a naturalist, you can be an atheist. Okay, these are all notions. These are all philosophies that can skew or clarify the data you're looking at. Or you can also be a theist. You can be a literalist, right? So there's different worldviews, and I think that we have to address the worldview also. Now, we do it through the specific points of evidences, and you can approach that, and I think you deal with the evidences and have a different perspective. But just now, science is just as much about philosophy as it is about data. That's the point. Anything else here? Questions? And we'll take a little break.